again, welcome. My name is Sarah Paterka. I'm with Interfaith Action of Greater St. Paul. On behalf of our staff and our board of directors, welcome. We are going to get started here right now. It is my pleasure to introduce Randy Ross, our executive director, who will be introducing our evaluation team. Randy, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Commissioner, for being with us. We're thrilled to be together for what promises to be a very engrossing afternoon together. I'm just going to say that Michael Quinn Patton and Charmaine Campbell Patton are our learning consultants and evaluators. They are world renowned. I've introduced them to you in detail several times before. Their full bios are in the chats. We are very fortunate to have Michael and Charmaine with us, and I'm turning it over to them.
Thank you so much, Randy. I am just going to start us off today by looking back at what you all shared with us from your second session conversations. So I'm going to just do a quick summary, and if anyone has questions, we can answer those, but want you to see what came out of those sessions. So we had 17 houses of worship report back, although I just saw one more come in. So we'll pop that up to 18. And so we'll be just over the 200 participants mark. This is a list of who has reported on a little map. So most of them are in the Twin Cities area. We've got a couple out state. And we first asked you for your initial reactions and questions, and a lot of them were about the officers and protocol, questions about was there mandatory reporting, what was the backup doing, what were the races and genders, things like that, as well as some questions about police training and what police are and aren't trained to do in these situations. There were also a lot of questions about the family situation, assumptions, and the issues of homelessness and domestic violence, obviously really front and center in folks' minds, as well as just the complexity of the situation. And then the importance of the context, especially the school, whether it was rural and urban, which wasn't clear to some folks, as well as the systemic issues and the systems of violence and challenges that we're facing this situation or at play in this situation. So it's just a summary of kind of some of those initial reactions. And then we asked you to identify the values at play. And the first time around, these were the values that came up. For open-mindedness, the importance of staying open-minded and not moving quickly into judgment. The keeping the safety of the most vulnerable, particularly the children and the women, front and center. The importance of acknowledging the complexity and the different issues happening in the situation. The approach of being of service and being helpful as a key value. Also doing the least harm possible or doing no harm. Having compassion and empathy, both for the women and children and for the father or the man in the situation. The values of dignity, respect, and civility. Calm and de-escalation, importance of keeping things calm and safe. Acting fairly, keeping in mind the civil rights of the family and focusing on the value of family generally, as well as their privacy. So that was a list of the first values that were identified. And when we asked you all to think about tensions, there were kind of 4 areas of value tensions. The first was about information gathering, how you make an assumption of innocence, but also you see evidence of a crime potentially, getting the whole story versus protecting the vulnerable and that information, the role of bias as well as privacy, and the sort of long-term, the need to act urgently versus do your due diligence. The second area was really around tensions of the officer's role. So that sort of service versus law mentality, compassion versus the importance of safety and potentially separating a family, controlling a situation versus seeing the complexity of the situation. So those were some of these tensions. The third area was the role of safety versus other values. So safety versus rights or safety versus basic needs. and I'll let you kind of look through that list rather than go through all of them, but this idea of like what, the tension between those things. And then finally, tension between rights of the women and children versus the rights of the man, and whether there needs to be a choice there, as well as children's rights versus parents' rights. So those were the value tensions. And again, I'm going quickly because we want to get to this year, month scenario, but I wanted to be sure to share with you these things, and we'll send you the slides as well. So then we asked, what should Officer Johnson do now? And there was an overwhelming feeling that it should be, any action should be led with compassion and concern, that service mentality, rather than starting by asking for a license and registration, starting with really asking about, do you need assistance? How are you doing? Really assuming innocence, but also gathering information. So taking the time to gather the story and rather than kind of jump to conclusions. Clear, calm communication, communicating what's happening, especially to the kids, and procedure, and not escalating the situation. A lot of people felt that it was important to separate the man and the woman and potentially the children to get the different stories. There were different feelings about this, but overall a sense of the importance of separating to gather information, and then bringing in additional resources, specifically housing, social work, another person as backup, and really kind of bringing in that systemic view of things. These were the faith readings that were used then. So after we kind of had that initial perspective on values and value tensions and actions, you all engaged in faith study of these different texts, 14 of them. And then the biggest changes that were reported and that I saw as well, and after the text studies, were the acknowledgement of power and the importance of making connection over kind of being in charge or being powerful, and really kind of doing whatever the officer can to acknowledge and reduce the power balance in the situation, as well as confronting implicit bias and any prejudgment. There were some challenges that were, assumptions that were challenged, particularly around potential drug and alcohol use, and conversation around the tension between family unity and safety, as well as an acknowledgement of the role of fear in this situation, and fear as the enemy of compassion came out a lot more after the text study, as well as the upholding humanity and dignity of all involved. There was more empathy and concern for the man and the officer after the text study than there had been. I think there was much more of a focus on the children and the women before the text study. And focus on how do we bring mindfulness into the police practice? What would that look like, and what would that take, particularly in situations that are tense? And a recognition that these are clearly systemic issues, and that there's personal responsibility and community responsibility. This can't just be about what the police do. And again, that systemic injustice, the system is broken, and how do we fix it? So then finally, we asked about priority values, and these are what came out kind of in round 2 when we asked about priority values. So many of them are similar, but there are some different lenses on them. Compassion and empathy really rose to the top, and I think the safety piece rose down a little bit lower, so that it was really more about dignity and safety, or dignity and compassion and empathy, as well as thinking about some of those systemic issues. And then finally, some of the final policy, or some of the final reflections included some policy recommendations around giving police a little bit more leeway to adapt to situations as they arise, and the context, as well as thinking about how some different actions that the officer could do, like how to set the families at ease. And so I'll go into more details about what some of those were in our report, as well as on police culture. And some people brought up the recent MPS, Minneapolis police report, as well as, we've got the anniversary of George Floyd's murder tomorrow. So like the context around police culture is on people's minds. And then overall, the model and the scenario in the tech study, we had good responses, nothing major folks wanted to change. I think that most people felt like it went smoother this time around. Some low attendance, but overall, seems like you all are hitting your stride. So I'll leave it there. And again, thank you. I know that was fast, but I'll be sure to share this information and happy to field questions or pass it back to Sarah.
Thank you, Charmaine. I appreciate that. Again, we will share those slides. So much in-depth answers and information coming out, which makes me excited for this next session and what's to come. With that, I would like to introduce both Professor Earl Schwartz and Commissioner Harrington. They will both be coming in with dilemma stories for us to listen and respond to this afternoon. So I believe Earl is first. So Earl, go ahead and take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. I look forward to speaking with you this afternoon once again about the issues that we are exploring. And today I begin with a story of my own. In the course of preparing for today's session, I told the story I'm about to tell you to the planning group. And I relate it to you now because it came to shape the third policing dilemma Commissioner Harrington is about to tell you. I was told this story by the person who in the story is called Lieutenant Wayne Marshall. He gave me permission to include it in a book I wrote with Rabbi Barry Citron many years ago, entitled When Life is in the Balance. But he asked that we not use his real name in the book. And in subsequent conversations with Lieutenant Wayne Marshall, it became clear to me that though many years had passed since the events he described had occurred, the story I'm about to share with you continued to deeply trouble him in ways which I hope might help us to explore what a person in a comparable situation in the context of policing might experience. In June 1966, Lieutenant Wayne Marshall began his first tour of duty in Vietnam as a platoon leader of approximately 40 US Army infantry soldiers, most of whom were 18 to 20 years of age. One evening in November 1966, Lieutenant Marshall and his platoon set up an ambush approximately 1 mile from their base camp. This ambush was intended to put a halt to the periodic nighttime mortar barrages the base camp had recently suffered. These mortar attacks resulted in the deaths of several American soldiers, which had greatly angered and frustrated Lieutenant Marshall and his troops. The platoon was intent upon putting an end to the attacks before any more American lives were lost. The area where the platoon set their ambush was under a dusk to dawn curfew. This curfew had been established by the South Vietnamese government, which was working together with the Americans against the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese forces. Lieutenant Marshall and his platoon considered violators of the curfew suspect as enemy soldiers and therefore subject to attack by American forces operating in the area. The Americans set up their ambush along a road they thought might be used by the Viet Cong mortar group that had attacked their camp. The signal for springing the ambush was to be Lieutenant Marshall's detonation of a mine the soldiers had buried under the road. At approximately 4 a.m, Lieutenant Marshall heard a rumbling sound coming from some distance up the road. The Americans readied themselves for the ambush. Approximately 30 seconds after he first heard the rumbling, its source came into view. An old man and his ox cart. No more than 30 additional seconds would pass before the old man came to the place in the road where the mine was buried. As Lieutenant Marshall watched the old man approach, he pondered who this violator of the curfew might be. Perhaps a transporter of Viet Cong weapons or soldiers, a scout for the mortar group, or perhaps just an old woodcutter out to get a jump on his competitors. As he considered these possibilities, he weighed his options: spring the ambush, confront the man, thereby revealing his position to potential attackers in the vicinity, or allow the old man to pass, whoever he might be, and whatever he might be carrying in his ox cart. No more than a minute passed from the time Lieutenant Marshall first heard the old man and his ox cart approaching, till the moment he made his decision. And with that, I turn to Commissioner Harrington.
Thank you, Earl.
You're welcome.
I appreciate hearing the story again. I've heard it before from you, and it's still, I've got friends that were in some of those places, and so it brings me back to conversations I've had with them. I also want to thank all the folks from Interfaith, the leaders in your congregation for joining Interfaith, and with me and all the rest of this group for what I believe is some very, very important work. These sessions continue to add value and enlighten the many conversations with lawmakers that I've had. Interfaith Action has been regularly mentioned, by the way. Perhaps your ears have been burning as I testified in the public safety committees in both the House and the Senate. And when I met with communities all over the state to talk about the violence we have seen, we've had 18 murders in St. Paul year to date, and there have been 35 murders in Minneapolis. And cities where you don't think about murder as being much of an issue, Richfield, Robbinsdale had a double the other day, and so many towns in greater Minnesota have had murders, and that's just the most heinous of the acts that we are seeing. These conversations were the basis of the proposals that Governor Tim Walz put forward, talking about the need for a yes and approach. He talked about needing both police reform and public safety. As we traveled the state from Duluth to Rochester, from New Ulm to Brooklyn Park, and from a lot of other places in between. I want you to know that this work and these conversations have meant a lot to me. They still mean a lot to me. It's personal to me for a lot of reasons, probably not the least of which is that I was Black long before I wore blue. And I don't forget, I haven't forgotten where I came from, and I haven't forgotten what my children are and my family and where my community lies in this really razor thin dichotomy between public safety and police reform and people being safe. These conversations are, I would argue, probably just the most recent step in what Department of Public Safety has done in the last 3 years. And in fact, they were in no small part why I hired Nicole Archibald to come in as the first public affairs director for the department. We didn't have a public affairs. We didn't have an external facing component to the department before we got here, before Nicole. And in 2019, we brought Nicole in as the Attorney General. Keith Ellis and I led the Minnesota Working Group on Police-Involved Deadly Force Encounters, which after a year or so put forth recommendations. They were signed into law in July of 2020. And I note the date of that because it's after George Floyd. They were done before George Floyd, but they didn't get signed into law until the community's demand for reform was loud enough that the elected officials took notice of it. The impetus for that work came from leaders like you who had my ear and Keith Ellison's ear long before we were in our current positions. And I'll give you just a little insight that as much as that may sound historical, but last week I was over at the Mall of America with Valerie Castile and Greg Coleman and a group, Sherman Patterson, a bunch of other people have this program called Lights On, which I really would like to recommend to IFA to look at also, but that's a sidebar here. And Valerie Castile testified, and I mean that in the most Baptist sense of the word, about the death of her son, Philandro. And we all, it was a room full of cops and a room full of community folks, and we listened and we learned from Valerie, we've learned from you. And today I want to talk about deadly force, and it is a complicated topic. It was complicated when we started the conversation in 2019, when we learned that 50% of the cases involved someone who was in crisis. And I, once again, as you think about the impact of your words on me, think about the fact that we were proposing co-responder models so that mental health professionals would respond to people in crisis and not just cops. I think that's an important piece. It didn't pass through the legislature. That's another topic entirely. But that was our proposal, was to fund the co-responder models so that we could reduce that 50%. I know that crisis calls is not just the province of police, and all of you that are ministers have had your share of, I'm sure, scary moments where you're ministering to somebody who is not necessarily in touch with reality. It's surprising to me, and I appreciate the folks from Greater Minnesota that view these calls, and I've heard from many of you separate from the calls itself, that, because we know that 60% of the cases of deadly force by cops happen in Greater Minnesota. They don't all just happen in the cities, and I think that's a misnomer. During that first meeting, there are two things that I remember very clearly, and they were the voices of survivors. One group was there in disbelief and protest, quite honestly, that anyone would try and make a difference. And then what I most remember, though, was the voices of the moms, Valerie, and the mom who's lost her son in Oakland. Their voices were softer, but I would say their words were more powerful. And they told us that having this really hard conversation was, in fact, the right thing to do, because we have to stop this. This is maddening, and it is the definition of insanity. Much as I've asked you for help in creating recommendations for the future, I want you to know that a lot of the voices that you have brought me have been heard. In the state law is a provision that says that life is precious, that there's a sanctity to life, and that should be recognized by every cop. And that being afraid is not enough to pull a trigger and to end someone's life. That's now law. It's not proposed law. That's actually in state law, and it comes from these kinds of conversations. They're taking care of the families after the fact, and mandatory reporting and additional funding for police training, and having body cams so that we can hold cops accountable when they do the wrong thing, and also so that we can give the families some peace and when they do the right thing, even if it's horrible. Loss of life is tragic, and I think Earl's example gives you a flavor of that, and what I'm going to tell you, which is my story of that kind of situation, could have been tragic, and I'm interested in your take on this. So this is my story. It's late after 9 p.m. or 2100 hours, as we would say it in the cop world. There's a one-man squad in St. Paul. He's dispatched to a prowler call, which means somebody is walking around somebody's house or walking around somebody's property, and somebody has seen that. It's on the east side of St. Paul. The caller is a woman with kids who has heard voices outside of her house and has seen someone standing in her bushes. Woman has been asked to stay on the phone As the officer drives to the call, and while still en route, the officers told the woman can see a light-skinned male dressed in dark clothes crouched beneath her window. Woman tells that she can hear voices next to her bedroom window on the first floor, and that she has kids. She's afraid. She thinks the person is going to break in. She's afraid he's going to break in. She's afraid for herself. She's afraid for her kids. And the dispatcher has now upgraded that call from a prowler call to a possible occupied burglary in progress. As the officer gets close to the house, he cuts his lights off. He stops the car a few houses away behind the house. He lets the dispatcher know that he's on scene, and he asks, is there backup coming? And this is one of those misnomers that most people have when you ask them, how many cops do you think is working at any given time? When I worked midnights on the east side, which is where this would have happened, there were 6 people at any given, on a good night, we had 6 people. But I can tell you that I talked to Charlie Adams, the inspector for the 4th precinct, that's all of North Minneapolis. On an average day, they have 4. And Minneapolis requires every officer to be in a 2-officer squad, so that means that's 2 cars for the entire 4th precinct. The dispatcher says the backup squad's still a ways away, and tells you the caller is getting a little more frantic. The caller can still hear voices. The caller can hear sounds. The caller is bringing her kids into the bathroom. The caller is afraid, and the panic is you can hear it in the dispatcher's voice. The officer walks around the back of the house. He can see a screen that's torn at the back of the house, but it doesn't look like the window's open. It's dark in the yard, and the officer can't see very well. And he's trying to make a decision. Does he wait and let his eyes adjust to the darkness, or does he turn on his flashlight and light himself up, which, if the person there is armed, could put him in immediate danger? As the officer walks around to the front of the house, he sees movement in a thick evergreen bush around the side of the house. He sees a human shape, and crouches down behind the steps. He turns on his flashlight, and he can see sneakers at the base of the tree. The officer yells to the person to come out with their hands up. The officer still crouched down behind the steps, where he's got some cover. At least he's got some concealment, and tells the person, come out slowly. He repeats it. He repeats it. And he repeats it. And he's yelling now, the officer is, hands up, get your hands up, tells the person to come out slowly, and the person doesn't move. The officer can hear the person moving in the bushes. He can see the figure, and the figure has something in their hands, but you can't tell what it is. The object is dark, the bushes are dark, the person is dark, and now the person is moving. The officer remembers what his training says, look for the hands, because the hands are where you're going to get killed. You look for the hands. You look for what's in the hands, because that's what can hurt you. The training officer reminded him that over and over again. And the officer is yelling now from behind cover, put your hands up, drop whatever's in your hands, drop it now, drop it now. And the person doesn't drop it. The officer can't tell what's in his hands, and the person is still moving. And the officer's wondering, how old is this person? He's not very big. What is in his hands? And why isn't he stopping? Why won't he put his hands up? Why won't he drop what he's carrying? The dispatcher's chirping in the officer's ear, asking if he's code 4. The officer tells him that he's not code 4. The scene isn't secure, that he's got one in front of him. And you can hear in the background the sirens as the other cops now start kicking into the gear to come and back up the officer who's there by himself. The officer's thinking, this is bad. This is bad. He's trying to remember his training. He's afraid, kneeling behind those steps. He's alone, and he's screaming now at the guy, get on the ground, get down now. And the person steps out of the bushes and turns towards the officer. Can he hear him? Doesn't he understand him? If he's carrying a gun, you can take a shot now. There's nobody behind the person. There's a clean shot if I take a shot right now. But what if? What if it's not a gun? What if it's not a knife? What if he's drunk? What if he's a kid? What if he's a rapist? What if he's a burglar? What if? That's the dilemma.
Thank you, Commissioner Harrington. That is a powerful dilemma. Earl, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Commissioner Harrington. As you can see, if there is a single bridging concern between the story I told you a few moments ago and Commissioner Harrington's dilemma, it's that in both cases, there's now a clock ticking. But I would note that, in fact, in both stories, as we consider a brief conversation about Commissioner Harrington's dilemma, that there are actually two clocks ticking in these stories. On the one hand, it's clear that the narrative we've just heard is one in which every second matters. And as you respond to the questions the story poses, I'd ask once again that we pay attention to ways in which it precludes simply citing cherished values, in as much as it's the kind of messy life situation in which, if we think carefully, particular values we would affirm may begin to collide. And so the need to prioritize those ethical principles in light of our best guesses as to likely outcomes in circumstances where guessing is extraordinarily difficult and the consequences enormous, and all measured against the realities of a stopwatch. But as I said, there's a second clock ticking as well. One that was set long before the story begins and continues after, marking the development of circumstances and conditions that are likely to shape how each of the dilemmas we've grappled with unfold. And I say this now because as you start to plan your reports to the project on this dilemma, along with the conversations you've had more broadly in your congregations, I'd ask that you be sure to include, first of all, both here and now concrete on-the-ground responses to the specifics posed by these dilemmas, but also note that second clock. That is, that you find a way in your reports to also share observations about the longer story of circumstance. And now, questions to pose as we begin to consider what we've just heard from Commissioner Harrington. First of all, the question we've posed on each occasion thus far: what ethical principles and standards should govern the actions of the police officer in this dilemma?
Should we put the Mentimeter up? Earl?
Yes, please.
Okay. We'll put the Mentimeter up so folks can share, and the link will be in the chat for you to go to. Charmaine or Michael will put that in the chat, and the question will be there, and you can type in your answer. And there it is. We just need the link in the chat. Or you can go to menti.com and use that code. Oh, there we go. If you want to say it out loud too, Earl, are we good with that too?
Absolutely.
Feel free to unmute yourself as well.
Sanctity of life.
Sanctity of life. And Kate, by that you mean all of the potential lives involved, at stake, perhaps threatened by these circumstances.
Yes, sir.
Yes. And as we consider that, we immediately see the potential tangle of related values drawn into the conversation. Thank you.
In the house and outside of the house as well.
In the house and outside as well. That's right. Thank you. Any other initial observations regarding, oh, caution, caution. If you'd like to add a verbal comment explaining your Mentimeter contribution, please do so. Could I ask for the participant who's added that we should always start with nonviolence, is it possible that the officer in the story we've just heard would respond, I did, and it proved inconclusive? Would anyone want to respond to that possibility? I did try nonviolence. Is it more complicated? Yes, how so? I see in the chat, it is more complicated. Would you like to perhaps tell us what you mean?
Sure, I would be happy to jump in here. That wasn't my words, but the more complicated obviously is. One of the things that I think is unfortunate in our training of peace officers, formerly known as law enforcement officers, is this idea that we train them to follow orders, we train them to follow directions, we train them to do things in a certain way. And then they deal with people who don't have the same training, who may not follow orders, and certainly are not going to do things in the same way. And so that's where I think it is more complicated. The idea that I told you to stop, or I told you to do something, and that 30 seconds, minute, 90 seconds later, you are not complying, from the one perspective, looks like you attempted to use nonviolence. On the other side, if after violence has happened, doesn't seem to be an adequate response to that particular value. That is my perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. Much appreciated. And perhaps we could say that it's possible that the unknown person in this story would understand what the officer said was a nonviolent opening to this confrontation with but the violence is always implicit in such encounters. Just because you didn't say it, just because you didn't do it, doesn't mean it's not already part of what's unfolding. Thank you. Thank you. Let me say that, as I suggested a little earlier, in this particular case, it may be especially helpful to do what we can to imagine what might be passing through the thoughts of the officer. I had the opportunity to talk at length with Lieutenant Wayne Marshall outside of the parameters of the story about what he was thinking about that early morning. Here's one thing that he added. When I saw that old man, I thought to myself, he reminds me of my father out early in the morning to open up his little storefront business, because the only way he could make it work was if he got out earlier than the others. This was a soldier under the most tense circumstances, with the clock running, with lives at stake, both his immediate platoon and those back at the base. And his thoughts wandered back to his father in Minneapolis. With that, I would ask that we quickly consider a second question. In reaching your response to question 1, did you need to prioritize any ethical principles which in other circumstances you would see as being of equal importance and not conflicting? If so, which principles, and why have you prioritized them in this way? Uh-huh. Mhm. Uh-huh. Mhm. Wonderful responses.
Earl, I'm just going to jump in and read them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Sanctity of, oh, they're gone. Can we slow down? In the case of the officer, the courage to make yourself vulnerable, knowing that backup is on the way and will protect the family. Sanctity of life is the principle, but whose life? The person in the bushes, the officer, the residents of the house, the backup officers? Caution is the principle I prioritize because it helps both sides of the dilemma. De-escalation, because by bringing a lethal option to the situation, the officer has the only one we can confirm. The only way to go and preserve life is to de-escalate. Safety of self, because if I am compromised, I can't protect the person in the house. Let's go one more. Trying to create a connection under duress. And I want to point out one comment in the chat from Patrice. What if the person is afraid that he will be shot in the way that other persons who look like him have been shot? Thinking of Philando Castile. What if the person is hearing impaired? The officer seems to be escalating the situation by shouting. What if it's a scared kid? No one has been hurt yet, but the officer's actions seem to make it more likely that someone will be hurt. Just a couple thoughts going out there.
Yes, yes. Wonderful, thoughtful responses. Yes, I certainly appreciate the comment up now. Unlike the social reference, to make war, the primary principle of the police ought to be to make peace. To the extent that policing is influenced by a military model in so many ways, is it made less capable of actually engaging civil circumstances?
One that just kind of flips by was the power of relationships as well.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you. And with that, I'll turn things back to Sarah.
Thank you, Earl. And these are two questions you can ask along with the others that we have on the note sheet for this dilemma. Now it's my privilege and honor to introduce someone you all know, you get emails from all the time. Phil Romine, Reverend Phil Romine. He's our congregational engagement coordinator here at Interfaith Action for about a year, a little over a year. And the pleasure that we have working with Phil is that he's also an ordained Presbyterian minister. So he gets to share our text study today. So take it away, Phil.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you, everybody, for sharing, for holding all of this. I just have a brief snippet to share from my tradition's sacred text, and then a little bit of commentary to sort of set you all up for your conversations as you continue to unpack the scenario. So our text this afternoon is from the Gospel according to Luke in the Second Testament or the New Testament of the Bible, chapter 23, verses 44 through 47. This is one of the selections that's available in the Christian source book that we made available. And this in this short section is one rendering of the death of Jesus. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." Now, as with any sacred text tradition, or principle, there is a lot to unpack here. For the purposes of your conversations, and in light of the deeply personal story that the commissioner has shared, I want to highlight two things in particular about the text. The first is the setting. Jesus is being executed by the state of Rome alongside others convicted of crimes, and his execution comes despite repeated statements by Roman officials that Jesus is innocent of the crimes he's being charged with. In the course of my tradition's history, there's been lots of arguing about who's responsible for Jesus's death and the conclusions and consequences that Christians should draw from that. But it bears noting here that whoever else is or is not blamed for Jesus's death, there can be little doubt that the Roman justice system clearly fails Jesus. The second item is related to the first. Specifically, it is the centurion's final pronouncement of Jesus's innocence. Now, most scholars agree that Luke, at least in part, used similar sources as the writer of another Christian narrative about Jesus, Mark's Gospel, and that it is likely that portions of Mark's Gospel were borrowed by Luke. What's interesting is that in Mark's Gospel, in this same scene, the centurion says, "Truly this man was God's son." But in Luke, it is certainly this man was innocent. So why would Luke shy away from making an explicitly theological statement to make what seems to be an overtly political one? Now, it is certainly not the only way to answer this, but one way to answer this question is to see the fullness of the centurion's humanity on display here. Because the centurion is simultaneously culpable in this tragedy, accusatory toward the system that has killed an innocent person, and aware of something profoundly divine in what can only be described as an utter tragedy. Before saying he was innocent, the centurion praises God. This is part of a pattern in Luke's gospel in which people behold something that Jesus says or does, and then those same people praise God as a response. I think that the centurion's response speaks to the reality that something divinely tragic has taken place. And in addition, his statement is an indictment of both the Roman justice system as well as his personal participation in that system. It highlights the reality that while some of us suffer disproportionately from unjust systems, all of us suffer ruptures with our own humanity when injustice persists. And the centurion must now bear the tragedy that he's witnessed and participated in at great cost. So among the other considerations in this text, I would invite you to consider these points as you re-engage the commissioner's story. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
We've got the Mentimeter question up for our post-text study. Thank you, Phil, again. Rev Romine. I don't get to call you that very often. How, if all, has the text study led to rethink your response to the dilemma? Please share any rethinking, deepening, questionings, clarity, etc. You can, again, put it up on the Mentimeter. Charmaine put it in the chat. Put it in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself. We can, go a little rogue here and talk a little bit. So we'll do this for a minute or two, see if anything bubbled up in your breakout rooms before we kind of move on. I'm going to keep my eye on the Mentimeter and open up the chat here. Such riveting conversations. We're not going to share.
Really?
It's all good. Want to be cautious so you don't end an innocent life. Yep. I'm watching the chat too. Again, feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to share directly with the group. The discussion led to changes for me. Could the officer have waited a bit longer before responding? Hearing, surely this man was innocent. Often is that the case? Good question. The text highlighted the failure of the system, and this dilemma just amplifies the failure of the system because there is so much that is unknown and so much complexity. Yeah. A recognition of who creates rules to be followed and how, where we continue to recognize humanity life. What is the balance? From the chat, recognize that the suspect could also be frozen by fear. I think I would be. I love the way it showed the two forms of responses. Outward, reactive political analysis. Inward, a form of worship. Integrating divinity in our human experience. Yes. It made me realize more deeply my responsibility for being part of the civic society that builds systems that limit, define our range of possible responses in a situation like this. In the chat, I'm struck by the implications of Rome's occupation of the Holy Land in the text and analogies to communities that feel they are also occupied by the police presence and a larger system of structural racism and inequality. How do occupied people gauge actions and reactions in ways we cannot comprehend? Very great. Will, I can add these chat comments as well into the notes and the PDFs that we'll send out at the end of this session as well. Again, thank you, Phil, for sharing the text study. I'm going to toss it back to Commissioner Harrington. It was brought up in our small group. So what happened? This is a personal story, dilemma. So the question was, what happened next? And he's willing to share the what happened next.
Sure. Well, I didn't pull the trigger. And I didn't pull the trigger not because I wouldn't have been legally authorized to pull the trigger, because if he's a burglar and he's trying to break into the house, the owner of the house would have the right to use deadly force to protect herself and her kids. And the police officer would have had the right to use deadly force to stop a person committing a felony at that time. I didn't pull the trigger in no small part because my gut told me that I didn't have enough information, that I couldn't see a weapon. And at the time that I was this young cop, the standard was not that you had to absolutely see the gun in their hand or the knife in their hand, but the standard was that you needed to have a reason that you felt fear. And that just being afraid, which I can tell you as a young cop, you're afraid a lot. You're walking into big warehouses and you're walking into people's houses where they're fighting and you're afraid a lot. So just fear in and of itself wasn't a justification for using deadly force at that time. And in fact, that's part of what we've returned to now with these new rules that we've had since the deadly force encounters, to say that, in fact, you need articulable reason of the threat, that rather than just the fear of the threat. So the fact that I couldn't see his hands didn't make it right to me. And my gut told me it wasn't right. And I felt like I could stay sort of undercover behind the steps. And I felt like I had some area there. I had also been taught that time was on my side. I could hear the sirens. And if I could get this kid not to run and not to run toward me at that point, I was going to have backup coming. And that was going to give me more resources, but I needed to stall. I needed more time. And that's another lesson that we've all learned, is that you don't need to rush in, that you don't need to precipitate something. In a lot of cases, what you need to do is slow things down. The kid, and it was a kid, was a 13-year-old. He wasn't a burglar. He and his friends were playing ditch, which is a term that I learned here in Minnesota, which I think is hide and go seek where I grew up. But he and his buddies had been running through the bushes playing ditch, and he was the slow one apparently out of the deal. What he had in his hand was a football, which he didn't want to lose. But it's a big blocky object that he was holding at his midsection, which gave me great amounts of anxiety until I saw what the hell it was once he got fully facing toward me in the light. He has grown up. He is now a 40-year-old man, or thereabouts anyway. I see him every once in a while. He still lives on the east side. He drives a tow truck. He has kids that are probably the same age he was now. And he and I still, when we see each other, he remembers me, quite honestly, more than I remember him. But whenever he flags me down, he and I recall that night of him in the bushes and me screaming at him. And I was screaming at him. It's cool, calm, and collected was not what I had on that particular night. But I did have time, and I did have a gut sense that while he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, it wasn't a day that anybody needed to die.
Thank you, Commissioner Harrington. I appreciate the personal nature of this dilemma and your willingness to share it with us. It's at that time, we're going to wrap up this third working session. We've got 2 more Mentimeter questions that we'll put up on the screen. They are our last 2. Just kind of how are you feeling? Where are you with your takeaways for today? That's what we're doing. So take a minute to throw some takeaways in there. We'll also take a couple minutes. If anyone has questions or comments or concerns about this next session, we would love to have feedback from all the congregations, houses of worship by August 1st, giving you a little bit of lead time into the summer. As we know, Minnesota, we get this much summer, and we like to pack as much into it as we can. If you could pull your congregation, your house of worship together and have those conversations and get that uploaded on that same Google form with the same Google Notes by August 1st, that would be great. We are going to cut this video so you have the dilemma story as an option to show folks. And then for your leadership team, you'll be able to review this full video, this full almost hour and a half Zoom video as well. That will hopefully be up right after the Memorial Weekend holiday, up on our website with all of any other resources that you also would need. So I'm gonna be quiet for a second. If there's any questions, feel free to unmute or pop them in the chat. Phil and I, our email is also available. Please also do us a favor and check your junk and spam folders. We found out a lot of our emails went to junk and spam this week with our Zoom link on it. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
Commissioner Harrington, could I please ask a question prompted by this story? Are police officers currently educated implicitly or explicitly to the notion that they owe something more to the person who made the call than anyone else in the dilemma? Is there a latent message to that effect?
You serve the public, and the person that calls is the public writ large, and what they need or what they ask for is what prompts you to go there. I don't know that it is explicitly, because so much of what we're trained to do is focused on the rights of the suspect. And frankly, I would argue, and this is my other hat, we very rarely speak in as much detail or with as much emphasis on the rights of the victim.
I see. Yeah.
And I think that's an area that, for example, at Department of Public Safety, we have the Office of Justice Program, which houses our victim services unit. We have to remind cops that victims have rights and that you have a responsibility to them. And I don't think that's as explicit as it should be, but it also is a challenge because victims are not always right either. I mean, I've walked into 7-Elevens, which dates how long this story was, to hear the clerk go, shoot him, they robbed me. And it was kids that stole beer. That's really not a robbery. And I'm not pulling a gun on anybody at that point.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions about going forward? Any questions for the commissioner? He hasn't
Sarah,
muted himself yet.
is this our last dilemma?
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, this is our last dilemma. And that segues right into my last couple of comments. We are in the beginning stages of planning for what I'm calling our capstone wrap-up session. Once we get in all of the data, our amazing evaluation team will be pulling it together and reading it, researching it, pulling themes and values and principles all together to create something useful for Commissioner Harrington. And our hope and goal is that by the fall, because again, summer is this much and we jam this much into it, that we can present a session with all of you and open it up for your congregational members who participate in these conversations to join us as well on Zoom, so we can present our findings and have some comments from Commissioner Harrington, have some comments from our evaluation team and our education team led by Earl. So we'll have kind of that capstone piece in the fall. And also we're gonna be talking about what's our next topic. We feel as though we've got enough traction, enough interest to see where this group and interest goes for the next project.
Sarah, can I make a
Thanks for
quick
asking.
plug for your timeline, by the way?
Yeah,
My
can.
main job, now that they didn't pass much in the way of public safety at the legislature, is to create a budget for the next 2 years for the Department of Public Safety. That's my primary next job. And I would love to have your voices and your interest reflected in that budget. My governor repeatedly reminds me that budgets are not just fiscal documents, they're moral documents. And your voices will help make sure that we're pushing forward a public safety agenda that is not just fiscally sound, but is also community-based.
Commissioner, what's your timeline?
I need to have a budget by September, basically. So I'll take whatever comments and stuff you have by after Labor Day or whenever the fair is over with. But,
Labor Day.
that would be good. So, but I recognize that the summer is short for all of us. So I'll take bits and pieces, and then I will get some opportunities to continue to push forward new pieces of information, even as we may have presented the original budget, but we'll get to push more pieces of information as we go forward. But
yes, and I think that's doable. We can give you sneak peeks of what comes out from the evaluation team for
that would be
sure.
great.
One word reactions. Let's throw some reactions in there. Last Mentimeter. I love that. Thanks for throwing that up there. These are great ways to end sessions like this. And also, please know that we here at Interfaith Action, Phil and I, if you ever want us to come visit your house of worship to share more about not only these conversations that we are having through our clergy civic engagement sessions, we have other programs that we would love to come and visit you about too. Please let us know. Our summers are a little open to come and visit. We'd love to take you out for coffee or lunch and learn more about some of our Minneapolis congregations as well that are on the call with us today. So with that said, we've got calm pressure, pause, self-regulation, thought-provoking, humanity, enlightening, gratitude, inner life, intense, important, illuminating. Amen. Whew. I'll echo that one. Whew. Some great words. This was wonderful. With that said, I want to thank you all. One word from the chat, intense. I don't think intense is in there too. Thank you for being with us. Again, Phil and I will send you an email when the links are available on our website with all of the resources available for your discussions. We are here for you. Utilize us if you need us. And thank you all very much and enjoy your day.